So Middle Ages, like I said, cool period. Lots of people like it. I guess because of all this knights and other cool stuff. Well, it was not that much fun to live back then, but there's certainly some interesting developments, and in philosophy too, which we will talk about today. This is an interesting illustration. Louis IX, King of France, commonly known as Saint Louis, sailing with his troops on the Seventh Crusade. I don't know if you guys heard about the Crusades. What was going on with the Crusades? They were going to Holy Land. The knights were going to Holy Land, trying to liberate it from the infidels, the Saracens. And did they succeed? No, they failed miserably every single time. Lots of knights died there, but they kept on doing it. So that is one of those examples. Anyway, so what exactly are Middle Ages? The term refers to about 1,000 years in Western European history between the classical period, and last time we ended with the classical period. That was about the end. Traditionally, the borderline is considered fall of Rome, which is 476. So if this is our timeline, year 476 was the fall of Rome. Remember, it was sacked in 410, which shocked Augustine, but then they left. They sacked it and they left. In 476, they did not leave. They finally took over Rome and took over the entire Roman Empire, and those tribal chieftains became leaders of Rome. Even though, interestingly enough, Rome still had their Congress, they still had their Caesar, but they were all subordinate to those barbarians. The barbarians now could replace them anytime they wanted to, because they had the command. So they lived like this for a while before Roman Empire completely collapsed, but this period starting from 476 and roughly to like 1500s, this 1,000 years is considered the Middle Ages. We're going to flash through it very quickly, just talk about it today. Nonetheless, it is interesting, right? Brief survey of the Middle Ages. First of all, the fall of the Roman Empire. Shortly after Rome itself fell, Roman Empire collapsed too. Basically, it kind of fell under its own size. It was so huge, and at the time, obviously, they did not have internet, they did not have phones, so it was difficult to manage this gigantic empire, which was almost the entire Europe. And I guess Romans were also getting more and more pleased with themselves, and they didn't want to fight as much. They had so much money and so on, so many privileges, that they were a little lazy, and those barbarians took advantage of that, among other things. So one of the important things was they created themselves, the Romans, created two centers of power, one in Rome, one in Constantinople. Why? Because the empire was so ginormous that it was difficult for them to actually rule it from Rome. They needed another location. But as you can imagine, if you have two centers of power, obviously the temptation would be for both centers become powers on their own, right? Because why should Constantinople listen to Rome? And they started having disagreements and so on, and so it kind of started to split up into two halves, and that's already a problem, and then it started fragmenting even more. So that was the beginning of the end of the empire. The church was becoming, on the other hand, this more of a force controlling the whole thing, because the Pope, just like today, was in Rome, and the Catholic Church, and for many centuries it was just the Catholic Church, they did not have too many other divisions, was pretty much controlling everybody in Europe. Kings had their own countries, they had their own laws, but the Pope was an authority over everybody. And the church was more and more involved in all the operations of the state and of the human life. In fact, one of the best careers at the time was to join the church, because if you joined the church, you had real authority, whereas if you're a king, there are famous stories about some of the kings getting excommunicated by the Pope and then the king had to literally crawl on his knees to beg for the Pope's forgiveness, because once the Pope excommunicates you, your subjects also do no longer see you as an authority. Your authority is from God, and the Pope is a representative of God. If Pope says this king is no good, that's a problem. So at the time, the church had a huge control over everything. The religious orders had their own institutions. They had monasteries. The civil authorities have no control over this. If you become one of the monks there, you live by their rules, and king and all those other lords, they couldn't do anything to you. So that actually is kind of interesting. The church was becoming more and more important, and for our purposes, there's another interesting development at the time, is the birth of the first universities. Higher education goes back all the way to around year 800. Around the year 800, Charlemagne, who was actually a king of what today is France, introduced these first schools. They were cathedral schools. They were to educate monks at first. And it was closely related to this religious thing, but those were the first schools which later started turning into the university. The word university actually comes from Latin. Universitas just means a number of persons associated into one body, society, company, community, guild, or a corporation. Right? So basically, universitas just means like a union of some sort. People were forming them because students and their professors wanted to be protected also from whatever other groups of control in the society, and they were organizing. They had their first degrees instituted and so on. So early in the around year 1100, 1200, the first universities began to form, and by 13th centuries, by 1200s, there were actually several universities already flourishing in Europe. Paris, that was one of the oldest and most distinguished universities, University of Paris, Sorbonne. Today, unfortunately, they have University of Paris, but it's not the same because they had several reforms. It's kind of broken into pieces and no longer as prominent. Another one, Bologna. If you go to Bologna, it's one of the oldest universities in the world. Still a university. Again, not a very highly ranking now because they teach in Italian, and Italian language is not that popular. But so Naples, Montpellier, Oxford, and Cambridge, still in existence today, still considered among top universities in the world. Top 5, actually. They are in top 5, depending on the ranking. Both of them take their root in 13th century, years around 1200. What were they doing? Well, analyzing the arguments of important texts, debating significant intellectual issues of the day, and one of the most important things they were actually doing is try to again square faith and reason. How do they interact? How should we deal with them? Because faith, of course, is what the church was telling them. You should believe in God, you should believe in the Bible, and so on. But people still wanted to question it. And that was one of the first things universities were dealing with. This is the University of Oxford, actually, the way it is pretty much today. One of the oldest. That building here, that's from like 13th century, that tall, and that's the church, St. Mary's Church. This is where they were meeting up at first. At the very beginning, they did not have a specific building for the university. In fact, university basically was, at the beginning, what? Several professors moved into Oxford town, and the students hearing about it were also coming over to take lectures. They could meet anywhere pretty much, even in the open field if they wanted to. Students would pay directly to the professor, and at the end they were given like the degree of some sort, affirming the fact that they actually went through the course of education and deserve recognition for this, so they could get better jobs and so on. This is back in like the 13th century. This is how the first school program was at the first universities. First there was what they call trivium. Trivium, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. They were learning grammar, how to write well, right? Dialectic, how to speak well, and rhetoric is also, well, the difference between dialectic and rhetoric. Dialectic is a little bit more like philosophy 102. It's a little bit more logical rules. Rhetoric is more art of speaking in general, like communications. Right? So this is the first thing they were studying. They were doing all of this in Latin. At the time, Latin was already language of educated people. Latin was the language of the Roman Empire. After it collapsed, people actually started speaking different dialects, right? French, Spanish, Italian are all dialects of the Latin. They are closely connected, but it's different languages. Latin by itself disappeared as actual language of normal people, but it remained in the academia. So, and then once you finish this trivium, the next step was quadrium. This is when they studied arithmetic, mathematics, geometry, music, and astronomy. So that was kind of like after the first, I don't remember, couple of years I think was trivium, and a couple of more years this quadrivium. If you finished all that, you would get bachelor's degree. Now, just like today, and the whole system actually is very much similar, you could continue to get master's degree. If you get master's degree, then you have a right to teach, license to teach, and then you could get doctorate, which was on top of that. And by the way, you know, today there's only what, like three I think, or 4 doctorates. Doctor of Philosophy, Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Law, and Doctor of Theology. 4. That's the system, because back at the time, they didn't have chemistry, mathematics, biology, all of this was philosophy. So we still give Doctor of Philosophy in this discipline, but there's separate Doctor of Medicine, because medicine at the time was also separate discipline, separate Doctor of Law, because law was separate discipline, and separate Doctor of Theology, which was the queen of all sciences. Theology is the religious study. Okay. Scholasticism in particular grew up at this time. What exactly is scholasticism? Scholastic just means schoolmen, right? So they were called schoolmen because they were in school, but today we just use it as a specific term for this type of people, applied to anyone who learned or taught in the schools Charlemagne first established back in the 8th century. And they continued using this term later on. Their project became more or less to harmonize the church doctrines and the fruits of philosophical speculation. So the same project. How do you square religion with reason? Obviously, they were not trying to undermine the religion, but many of these religious questions which we saw were a problem for Augustine continued to be a problem, and there were different ways to approach it. So how did they do it? The typical method was this. A problem is formed in the form of a question, such as, is the existence of God self-evident? So if you were in a medieval university, you come to class, right? Your professor could start with this question. Could say, okay, today our subject is the existence of God self-evident? And then you'd be arguing for and against it. So some of you could, for example, say, yes, I think so. And then the professor would say, well, present the reasoning. Why? And you would present your reasoning. And somebody else could say, no, I disagree. Okay, why do you disagree? And they would present their reasoning. At the end of class, ideally, the professor would kind of square it out, right? Summarize and give his opinion. So that's kind of the process they were going through, the resolution of this. And if you did the reading, it's done in a similar way by Aquinas as well. What were they using? First of all, the authorities. Of course, the Bible itself, holy, sacred scriptures, that's the authority number one. The Bible is not to be questioned, but obviously the Bible doesn't tell you everything, right? And some of it can be taken allegorically. So how exactly do you take it? Then church fathers, including Augustine. Augustine's writings at that time were already considered also part of the doctrine. He died, almost 1,000 years earlier. So for them, he was already like the holy figure, and he did get holy recognition, which is why we call him Saint Augustine. Boetius, that's another person from the 500s who also wrote a lot of interesting stuff. And the later work of Aristotle, we will talk about it in a moment. Works of Aristotle were rediscovered. They actually were lost for a long period of time. At the time, 13th century, they started coming back to Europe. Anyway, we will talk more about it, but few other things to know. So what were the most important problems they were discussing? Why did they worry about these subjects? One of them was the problem of the universals. We'll talk about it in a minute. The other, the problem of faith and reason. We already talked about it, so hopefully it will become even more clear when we see examples. And the last one, relation between will and intellect, which we will talk about next time. And it is very interesting because these three were the main subjects of disagreement. This is what they were kind of trying to understand. And they're still very, very important philosophical questions. So let's start with the problem of the universals. Universal is, remember those Platonic ideas, something which certain things have in common. Like, why is this all tables? And why is this all chairs? What is it about them that makes them all tables and makes them all chairs? Why are we all human beings? What makes us all human beings? Is there something which kind of unites us in that sense? So remember what Plato thought. Plato thought that there is like this idea, as he called it, of forms. There's a form of humanity which is somewhere outside this world, and we all participate in it, which is why we're humans. But there is also a form of table, and all the tables participate in this form. So this is the problem they were trying to discuss, also based on Aristotle, because remember Aristotle disagreed with Plato. What did Aristotle say? Did he think the forms are out there somewhere? No. He thought the forms and universals are actually within us. There's no separate universe. So this is the question. Porphyry, who was one of the translators of Aristotle, asked this question. He said, first of all, we need to figure out whether universals exist in reality independently, like Plato thought, or they exist in understanding alone. It's just a phantom of our imagination of some sort. It's in our mind. And if they exist in reality, if they are real, are they immaterial or material? So immaterial would be something which is in, like Plato again thought, somewhere but not part of the physical world. But material would be the way Aristotle thought, that they actually are part of us. They are kind of inside each one of us. And then the third question, whether they are separate from sensible objects or not separate from sensible objects. So are they part of us, like literally, that this is something you can even feel? Or is it just a kind of something within you, but you can't really figure it out? So these are the questions they were asking, and based on this, three positions emerged: realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. The realism, just as the word suggests, thought that the universals are real. This is following Plato, like universal actually real. There is a universal of table somewhere, not in this world, somewhere, but it is a real thing. It's not just in our head. So that's why they call it realism, right? Universals do exist in reality, but they are immaterial. Why did they think so? It seems crazy, isn't it? Well, for one thing, there is epistemological consideration. If universals do not name real things, what are we reasoning about when we say all human beings are something. Is there such thing as all human beings? It seems like there should be something we should be able to investigate, which is humanity in itself. And also theological. Why was it a theological problem? Remember the Adam and Eve, original sin. So remember, we all, according to the religious doctrine, participate in this original sin. We are responsible for what Adam and Eve did. Well, the question then becomes, why? Why are we responsible? If universals are real, the answer is because we all participate in humanity. They were humans and we are humans. And that's a real thing. This is what connects us. So once they committed a sin, we are guilty too. But of course, if you don't believe that this is a real thing, then that kind of goes against the church doctrine. Because then you may say, I shouldn't be responsible for Adam and Eve. Why? I don't even know who they are. I've never met them. Why should I be responsible for something they did with this apple? Even if they did it, right? It seems like it's unfair to blame us. So this is, for them, was a very important question. They were all deeply religious people, but they thought that they should get to the bottom of it and understand it. There is, however, a problem with realism because, well, if you think about it this way, we all participate in humanity. We're human, right? But we also are all animals, aren't we? So then we also all participate in the universal of being animal. But that's not enough. We also we are beings. So we participate in a being, and the ultimate being is God. So doesn't it seem like then we are also participating in God? But that seems like then we are part of God. And doesn't it seem to contradict the religious doctrine? Do you see the logic here? So that is to them was a problem. And for this reason, the other people, other scholastics decided to go the other way. They were nominalists. Nomina. Nomina in Latin just means names. And they were saying universals are just names. They are empty sounds. They don't mean anything. There is no such thing as universal. One of the representatives was Rosselin, who lived around 1050, 1120, teacher of logic in France. So nominalists said, no, universals don't exist at all. It's just names we give. When we say humanity, that's just a word. There's really no such thing as humanity. It doesn't exist. It's just a group of objects which we call human beings. We call them all people. There is another group of objects we call tables. But there's no such thing outside of that. Nominalism also has some problems, though. It makes universals themselves very arbitrary. Like, why is this a table and this is not a table? Maybe I want to call this table too. Right? Shouldn't there be something real which makes this table and this not? Because otherwise it seems like you can call anything you want, and yet we can't. And then it also undermines this original sin idea, because now you can say, well, okay, but back to the problem of Adam and Eve. If this is just words and we don't participate in humanity, why are we responsible for their sins? That actually was condemned by the church as a heresy. They were thinking that it is a dangerous idea that we don't participate in their sins. Another thing is the Holy Trinity. Remember, we mentioned it last time. It was an important problem. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What's in common amongst them? Is this three different gods? So are we polytheists? Or is it the same God? But if it's the same God, huge problem with crucifixion. Was God killed on a cross? Can you kill God? Isn't God all-powerful and so on? He was killed? So that seems like a problem. They tried to go around it, remember, by saying they share a substance. But that also assumes that there is such thing as the universal substance. And if you are nominalist, you are denying that. So to them it was another real problem which they were discussing in those first universities. And then there is kind of a compromise, conceptualism. Conceptualism is an attempt to combine both. Peter Abelard was the scholar who introduced it, again around this time. So basically it just says that universal word in itself is just a sound. But it gets its power from the fact that it points to universal concept. And the word's concept is the word's logical content, which is real. It's just that it is not a physical object. It's not a form somewhere out there, but it is nonetheless something real, which is part of objects and also part of our minds. It's kind of how it connects to objects in our minds. Okay, so back to universities. This is an interesting illustration. This is how it was happening in those first universities. So, for example, they could ask one of these questions about universal or something. This is professor, right, standing at the cathedra, as they called it. This is all the students, just like you guys, sitting there, taking notes, reading their bookipoos, and they are discussing these problems. This is actual medieval illustration of that. One of the other things happened at the time, rediscovery of Aristotle. So what happened with Aristotle? Plato was actually, well, several works of Plato were preserved. What was happening, first of all, one of the reasons why it happened, people stopped speaking Greek. Why did they stop speaking Greek? They didn't seem to need it. Bible was translated into Latin. They read it in Latin. The language of the Roman Empire was Latin. Fewer and fewer people could speak Greek. But remember, the books were handwritten. They had to be copied, word for word. If you don't speak Greek, you can't even copy the damn book. After 100 years, 200 years, it becomes so fragile it falls apart. So there's no longer book. The only books which were translated into Latin has survived. And those were very few books, actually. Because, again, it's a tedious process. You have to rewrite every single word. So they had some of the works of Plato and some of the works of Aristotle, but very few ones. The works of Aristotle, which they still had, were logic, mainly logic. They didn't have his metaphysics. They didn't have his physics. They didn't have his ethics. They were all lost in Europe, right? We're talking about Western Europe. They were not lost everywhere, which is why they were rediscovered in Palestine due to the Crusades. When these people went there to liberate the Holy Land, they actually discovered that those infidels, the Arabs, still had works of Aristotle in Arabic language. And they brought them back. And after they brought them back, they started translating it into Latin and reading them. So first works were actually from Arabic to Latin. They were not in ancient Greeks. Then they started discovering and that actually had a huge effect. Because remember those things we talked about in metaphysics, in physics, of Aristotle? They were very, very revolutionary for those people. They could see that this is smart stuff. This is not something you can easily dismiss. But the question then again becomes, is it compatible with the religious belief? Can you actually put them together? And this became a huge project. The first reaction of the church was they banned all these books. They banned them. They said, if students as much as talk about Aristotle, you'll be expelled from the university. Well, guess what happened? Did it work? Of course not. Students continued reading them and talking about them, because you cannot just tell them don't do it. That's insane. It doesn't work. So then slowly they started adopting it. And by the end of the 13th century, they actually had them as part of the curriculum. They were studying them and trying to make sense of them already with professor at the helm, because professor could at least lead this discussion and try to swing it his way rather than letting students do it themselves in, I don't know, corridor or something. So that's what was happening at the time. And that brings us to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was an enormously influential figure, specifically because of his work on Aristotle. When he himself entered the first university at the age of 14, believe it or not, they were going to university at 14. It was almost like high school for them. That was this time. The students were reading Aristotle, but it was still partially banned, and the authorities didn't allow it. Aquinas immediately loved Aristotle. He thought Aristotle was perfectly compatible with religious doctrine, and he integrated Aristotle in a very, very smart way into the religious doctrine. Later on, Catholic Church actually considered his work the ideal approach. And up until 19th century, his work on Aristotle and religious doctrine was considered the official doctrine of the Catholic Church. So the Pope endorsed it, they all endorsed it, but it took a while. So who was Aquinas? Interesting person. He came from a noble family. His family actually didn't want him to become a priest or anything like that. They wanted him to become a religious leader, like one of the bishops or something, to make a career out of church. But he himself, very early on, got interested in this Dominican order. Dominicans were like this religious group of religious monks who formed their own order. It was popular at the time. They had Franciscans, they had Dominicans. It was not the church in itself. It was kind of like this group of people who believed in God but wanted to live and work together. So it's kind of like a sect of the sort, right? And he decided to join the Dominicans. They were very influential. They actually had some professors in different universities, and they wanted him to become a professor in Paris. His own family did not like it, so he was even imprisoned for a year. His father, who was actually one of the dukes or something, decided to isolate him so he could, come back to his senses. So when he came back home to their castle, they lived in a castle, they locked him up for a year. And they were like, okay, no Dominicans for you, you are done. But even after a year, he still wanted to be a Dominican. Dominicans were also, they had like this vow of poverty, right? They didn't have any property and stuff. They were wandering around with this like just very, very simple clothing. And obviously his father didn't like it. So after a year, his father finally said, okay, whatever, you want to be Dominican, go ahead. I can't do anything more other than like kill you or something, and I don't want to kill you, so go. And he went on and he became Dominican. He became a very influential figure within Dominican order. They sent him to University of Paris. He was one of the professors there, so the order was kind of helping out its members to even obtain academic positions and so on. And he was writing a lot of works. Mainly, again, trying to combine Aristotle and traditional religious doctrine. Eventually, in December 1273, he had this mystical experience, as he said, and he stopped writing. And he said, I've seen something, and after what I've seen, all my writing seems to me like total nonsense, so I'm not going to do any more work. And few months later, he was on his way to some sort of a council, hit his head, and died. Yeah, somewhat of a weird story, but I'm sure it impressed people at the time. He was still not very old, so he was born 1225. When he died, he was 48 years old, right? Not that old. From what I read, basically what happened is he was they were just walking, right? He was walking to France, which probably takes, I don't know, several months if you're just walking from Italy to France. He was walking, and somewhere he hit his head on a tree, and he didn't immediately die, but well, they didn't have any medicine, right? So they were just waiting what's going to happen, and he slowly died. It took him a couple of weeks, and then he died because of that. Hard to say what kind of damage it did, but that's how it ended. Declared saint after about 60 years after his death, the church declared him a saint, and his work is still considered extremely influential. Now, his whole project, like I said, was to make sure that Aristotle is accepted in a church doctrine. He loved Aristotle, he fought Aristotle, even though some of the things Aristotle was saying were not compatible with the traditional doctrine. Like, remember, we talked about Aristotle. What was there not acceptable to the church authorities? Well, for one thing, Aristotle did not believe in life after death. Remember, he thought that even though we have a soul, but once the body dies, the soul dies with it. There's nothing after that. And of course, that contradicts the traditional religious doctrine, which is life after death, the judgment, you'll be judged for your sins, and so on. Also, remember Aristotelian God? What did we call his God? His idea of God? So remember, he is moving the world by being the final cause, right? The world is kind of striving towards God. Final cause is God. But does he do anything? No, he does nothing. He's an unmoved mover. He's not moving. He did not create the world. He is just an abstract thinker who thinks about thinking. That's his God. Does it sound like Christian God? Not exactly. So another problem. Church authorities obviously had a problem with all of this, but Aquinas thought, no, that is good ideas. Even though he was obviously not religious in the same sense as people were religious in the 13th century, he thought his ideas are perfectly compatible with traditional Christian doctrine. So, what did Aquinas himself think? This famous doctrine is actually in Latin called exitus reditus. All creatures derive from God, and God is their final cause. So again, just like in Aristotle, final cause is God, but also the origin is God. Why? Because God actually created us, and God is waiting for us in the end. So God, we exit from God, and we enter back into God. Exitus reditus. God is happiness. You want to be happy? Right? Remember Aristotle was writing about what is the goal of your life? Happiness. We all want to be happy. Well, here's your answer. God is happiness. Believe in God and you will be happy. Creatures are related to God, but God does not relate to his creatures. So we love God, but God doesn't change. God did not have to create the world, and God, the creation is process for creatures, not for God. So he had like interesting system worked out, how he described all those things. Now, in terms of original sin, remember again, Augustine thought original sin damaged our rational capacity. In other words, because of the original sin of Adam and Eve, we are stupid. We all are stupid. That damaged us. We can get out of it through grace. But remember, grace is given by God on a random basis to certain people and not given to others. You cannot earn the grace. So some people are smarter than others because that's how God decided. He gave them grace. If God didn't give you grace, well, nothing you can do. Too bad. Now, Aquinas actually disagrees with that. Aquinas thinks that even though there was original sin, Adam and Eve, the apple story, it's all true, but it did not damage our rational capacity. It only applies to our moral life. Because of this original sin, we all have tendency to sin in terms of morality. But we still have reason, and it's not damaged. So unlike Augustine, he believed we can use our reason to get to faith, to get to God. Much bigger value to reason. So this is kind of how he thought about the relationship between faith and reason. So let's take a look at this to understand. This is the line, right? We have God on the left side. We have the world on the right side. Now, certain truths are known by faith only. This is the part between A and C, right? A, B, C. This is what you can know only by, well, not only, this is what you can know by faith. There are certain things which you don't know by faith. What don't you know by faith? Well, you don't need faith to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Certain things you don't need faith for. But there is certain things which you need faith. There is also things you can know by natural reason. And there is an overlap. So you see there are 3 parts here. Part AB you can only know by faith. Part CD you can only know by natural reason. Part BC you can know by both. So first A and B. What can you only know by faith, you cannot know by reason? Holy Trinity. The fact that there is Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Your reason can't get you there, right? How do you know there? This is from the Bible. So you have to take it by faith. The other thing, the incarnation of the Christ. Original sin itself. The fact that Adam and Eve sinned. Again, the reason can't tell you this. You have to take it on faith. The Bible says it, that means that happened. End of story. But, well, and the last part, of course, certain things, like I said, certain things which are sensory experience and so on, you don't need Bible for that. You don't need a Bible to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is certain things which are here. But there are certain things which you can approach by both. What are they? Existence of God. The Bible tells you God exists, but you can also prove it with the use of logic. And that's what, by the way, what reading was about. The existence of the soul. Bible tells you there is soul, but you can also prove it using reasoning and logic. Immortality. The fact that you don't die after death. Again, Bible tells you, but you don't have to take it on faith. You can also prove it using logic. And this is what he was trying to do. Based on all this, there's 2 kinds of theology, right? Revealed or supernatural theology talks about the things which you cannot prove with logic. You just take it on faith. But there is also what he called natural theology, and this is the type of things which talk about God and so on, but you can use your reason to prove them as well. So first of all, this is question 2 there. The first question was whether sacred doctrine is a science. The second question is the existence of God. And he asks 3 related questions. Is the existence of God self-evident? In other words, do we need to prove it at all? Because, for example, do I need to prove that there's a bottle on this table? No, you can see the bottle. But I may need to prove to you, for example, that there are students in the room next to us, because you can't be sure, right? So if I tell you there are, and you tell me, no, there are not, I need to prove it. So, is existence of God self-evident? That's the first question. Do we need to prove it or not? Is existence of God demonstrable? So, if you do need to prove it, can you actually demonstrate it? Because, again, let's go back to the example of students in the room next to us. How could we demonstrate? Could we demonstrate that there are students there? Well, one way we could just go and look, right? We could all go there and look. But even if we didn't go there, could we somehow figure it out? Could we do some experiment? What do you guys think? Yeah, like, for example, I could start knocking on this wall very hard. right? And if there are students, they could get annoyed eventually, and somebody would come here and go like, what the hell are you doing here? Why are you knocking at this wall, right? So similarly, you may be able to demonstrate the existence of God, or maybe not. That's the second question. Assuming that, of course, it's not self-evident, because if it's self-evident, you don't even need it. But if it's not self-evident, and of course, as you probably guessed, the answer to Aquinas, it's not self-evident, then maybe we can demonstrate it. And finally, of course, the last most important question, does God exist? Based on all that. So he goes through all these questions. So first, is it self-evident? He does not think so. He does not think the existence of God is self-evident. That's actually related to one of the arguments for the existence of God made before Aquinas. There was another guy, St. Anselm, who lived a couple of hundred years before him, who presented the very first argument for the existence of God, so-called ontological argument based on ontology is existence, the existence of God based on the existence. So how does it work? He said it's very simple. So he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was very logical person. He believed in logic, and he thought logic proves to you the existence of God in a very simple way. Here's his argument in a nutshell. What is the definition of God? What is God? God is the greatest, the best thing, right? If you have good things, the God is the best one, and he also is the greatest thing. So he said, okay, let us imagine there are two gods. God number one and God number two. The first God exists. The second God doesn't. Which one is greater? First one. He says, there you go, that's your proof. By definition, God is the greatest thing. By definition, God exists. Case closed. If you think God doesn't exist, you don't understand what God is. You don't understand the definition of God. But if you understand the definition of God, St. Anselm claimed, you know God exists. So to him, there's no need to prove anything. As long as you understand the definition, we are done here. This is kind of step-by-step argument. So I have within myself an idea of God, right? Number two, the idea of God is the idea of being that is greatest that can be conceived. By definition, the greatest thing. And being is greater if it exists in reality than if it does not. If God, the greatest conceivable being, exists in understanding alone and not in reality, then a greater being can be conceived, the one which exists in reality. But, by premise 4, it's a contradiction. For it says, I can conceive of a greater being than the greatest conceivable being. The greatest conceivable being is the one which exists. So, case closed. I have an idea of the greatest conceivable being. Such a being must exist, both in my understanding and in reality. Therefore, God exists. So like basically one of the criticisms here is that the existence is not a quality you can attach to something and make it greater, right? It's not like, let's say you have a cat which exists, and cat which is only in your imagination, and cat which exists is somehow greater than the other cat. No, it's just that one exists, the other one does not. But it doesn't like make it any greater. What does it mean for something to be greater? Now, there was a similar argument presented at the time against St. Anselm. And St. Anselm said, no, but God is not a cat, right? God is really the greatest thing if you understand what God is. because it's not just another object. Now, the way Aquinas responded to it was basically this. Yeah, it could make sense, but you have to really understand what God is and how many people do. Right? So, that's not a kind of argument you can present to somebody who doesn't believe in God and make them believe in God. It could work for somebody who already believes in God, but they don't even need any proof. So he actually thought it's a bad argument. Aquinas thought that the argument does not work. Only the wise people, people who already kind of have this kind of knowledge, would believe in God using this argument. But he thought that there are actually ways to prove it to everybody, even to people who do not have this special knowledge. So his answer to the first question is it's not self-evident, but it is demonstrable. You can actually prove the existence of God using certain method, going from effect to cause. Right? We all experience the effect. What is the effect? The world. We live in the world. We see the world around us. So if we look at the world, we can go towards the cause and figure out that there should be a God at the beginning of it. So does God exist? Yes, Aquinas thinks he does, and there is 5 ways to prove it. So let's go through the 5 ways. They all have the same common theme. And it is, like I said, you look at the world and you say, if the world has the certain feature X, then there is God. And the world does have this feature, so it proves that there is God. So here's the first one. The motion or change occurring in the world. We see the world changing. Everything changes. Remember, again, this is this Aristotelian concept, potentiality to actuality. Something is something potentially, then it becomes it actually. Acorn is not an oak tree, but it can become an oak tree. And it does. A baby is not a fully grown human being, but the baby grows into a human being. So you see this, it's like a process, right? You can again put it like an arrow, the world from the beginning until today and so on. It keeps on changing and moving. Shouldn't there be somebody behind this change which sustains the whole change? Like a mechanism, like an engine, right? If there was no engine working on all this, so you can imagine this is God, and God is kind of like constantly keeping the world moving from potential to actual state, which is what makes the acorn into an oak tree, and then again another acorn into another oak tree, and so on. So that's like the type of Aristotelian unmoved mover, you may say. Remember how unmoved mover was making the world moving? The law. Remember the example I gave you guys. Suppose you are in love with somebody. They don't even know you're in love with them, but they change you. You dress differently. You put makeup. You do other stuff. Try to impress them. So that's kind of the idea. Everything happens because of God. The other thing is slightly different. All these 3 is called as cosmological proofs. Slightly different idea. The first one talks about everything keeps on moving. But he also says, well, what's the first step? The efficient cause. What has started the whole thing? Could it have started for no reason whatsoever? Like the physics tells us Big Bang happened. And again, you can ask the physicist, why? Why did Big Bang happen? And what would be the answer? I don't know. We don't even ask this question. We know it happened. That was the beginning. That's it. But they wonder, what happened? He will answer God. Of course, there is a God at the beginning of the process. The God created the world and gave it its first step. Clearly, there has to be some first cause for everything, including the world. The third one, also slightly different variation of all those things, possibility and necessity. So he says that everything in the world is contingent, as in it could be or not be. For example, if any one of us disappeared from this classroom and was not here, would the world really collapse or something? No. Any one of us is replaceable, any table is replaceable, even this whole classroom could disappear and the world would still be there. So we are contingent. But he's saying, shouldn't there be something which is necessary, which is not like that, which is not one of the things which could be or not be? And he says, yes, and that is God. God is necessary. And like all these contingent things, there has to be at least one necessary thing, and that is God. So this is three so-called cosmological arguments based on what we see in the world. Then there is the fourth argument based on Plato. Remember, Plato actually had these degrees of perfection. So if you go back, if you remember the Platonic, we did this kind of thing, the sun at the top, the hood, which is the most perfect form, and it also has the most reality. And then if you go down, there's less and less reality, and at the very bottom you find things like matter, which has the most evil component and the least reality. So everything you look around you, this is evil, is on this scale, right? Some things are better than others. Some things, also according to this system, have more reality than others. But shouldn't there then be the absolutely the best thing, like the source of all this reality, just like Plato thought? If there are things which are better than others, there should be thing which is the best. And that would be God. And that thing would then be the most real thing out of all of them. And finally, the teleological argument based on the design, so-called argument from design. Most of nature is blind and unintelligent, yet it seems to be orderly and striving to achieve purposeful ends. We talked about it already, right? Why are all these things started? Why did life start in the first place? It seems like if you just randomly throw atoms and molecules, you're not going to get life ever. But somehow life formed. The first primitive forms of life, which we know from science, and then they developed, and now we are here. What's going on? Could it be just completely for no reason? And together with Aristotle, he thinks, no, that's impossible. There has to be some purpose to this whole thing. This whole process, it's moving somewhere. It's moving towards something. Something is there at the end, and that must be God as a final cause. The final cause of the world. So it's all related to Aristotle. It's all related to the world. The fine details are not as important, but the idea is he thinks all of this proves the existence of God. So what about the evil again? What is evil? Remember, it still is the problem in Christianity. Like the question, why does evil exist if we have this all-powerful, all-good God? Well, in that he kind of agrees with Augustine. He agrees with Augustine that the evil is not real. It's a privation of good. Because God is the ultimate good, the further you are from God, the less good you have. And what we call evil is like the, zero good. So once you get there, there's simply no good. The only real evil would be what humans do, and they do it because they have freedom of the will to commit all those things. God, since he is supremely good, would never have allowed anything evil in the world unless he were omnipotent and good, that he could bring forth good even from evil. What good could come from evil?
I guess if it didn't start, then realistically,
well,
would that
not just that, but if there was no evil in the first place, why would you need the moon? there would be no boom. So that's kind of like two sides of the coin, right? You have to have evil to have good. If everything was good, there would be no good. It would just stop.